face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. This nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident.
Hello and welcome to Episode 5 of the Policy Dialogue series with alumni, staff, faculty, and students from the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. The views expressed do not represent official positions of the school or alumni network. Our goal is to discuss specific policy solutions that can address and solve the current local, national, and international challenges we face. We are recording this on October 21st, 2020. My name is Evan Papp, and I graduated with the class of 2011 with a focus on international security and economic policy. And I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab, which focuses on labor, political economy, arts, and culture. And before introducing our special guest, I want to introduce Raymond Nevo, who is a fellow alumni at the School of Public Policy. Raymond, could you let our audience know when you graduated, what you focused on, and what you are currently working on?
Thanks for having me. I graduated from the University of Maryland with a bachelor's in public policy just this May in 2020. And beginning in February of this year, I began working at the National Housing Trust based in Washington, D.C. And my job there is two parts. I am the co-lead for the Maryland and Pennsylvania Energy Efficiency for All Coalition, which focuses on promoting and advocating for energy efficient, multifamily, affordable housing in 12 different states. I also co-lead the Equity Working Group, which has a focus on centering racial equity into the entire project.
Very cool, very cool. I'm very excited to speak with Michael Bodaken, who from 1993 to 2018 served as the president of the National Housing Trust and was largely responsible for growing the organization and becoming a leader in the field of affordable housing and advocating for green preservation, urging the targeting of resources for energy efficient, affordable housing. Prior to joining the trust, Michael worked for Mayor Tom Bradley as deputy mayor for housing for the city of Los Angeles. Michael is also an adjunct in the School of Public Policy. Michael, thank you for joining us on the Policy Dialogue series. So before we jump in, could you talk about how you got interested in policy and why others should care about public policy?
So I guess I always cared a little bit about policy. I had a history and political science degree from the University of Iowa, but it turned out that I became a public interest lawyer for about 12 years. And during the latter part of that work, which involved, I was a litigator basically for the first 6 or 7 years for the Legal Aid Foundation. And I realized that all the lawsuits we were filing had, some good outcomes, but they didn't seem to be very long-lasting outcomes. And so probably in 1985 or 6, I became much more interested in trying to advocate for policy change at City Hall. I worked with tenants groups. I always liked affordable housing. It was something that I spent a fair amount of time on. Even before I became a lawyer, I was a tenant organizer in a Vista project in Kansas. In any event, I worked with tenants groups. I worked with nonprofits before the city council. And I really found that the kind of change that we were endorsing, especially when it was legalized, made legal, it was actually made official, that change lasted, that change was not just a temporary legal victory that somebody could do an end run around the following year. And I found that very fulfilling. And then I had been a big critic of Mayor Bradley, saying that I thought a lot of the funds from the redevelopment agency were being diverted to wealthier neighborhoods. And he called me in and said, if you think you're so smart, why don't you try to do it? And we had a bunch of discussions about it because I wasn't sure I wanted to go to City Hall, but it turned out that was a great decision, because I learned even further that when you're on the inside, as long as you maintain your integrity and you fight for what's right, you can actually make long-lasting change from the inside also. So that was my arc. And then about 4 years into that position, the National Housing Trust was looking for an executive director here in Washington, D.C. And I had been looking for something that I could lead. I wanted to lead something. And I came here in late 1993. We came for 1 year to try to turn around the National Housing Trust. We kept our home. We had no intention of staying very long. And here now, I don't know, 27 or whatever it is, years later, it's been an amazing journey. As Raymond knows, the trust is kind of known for the synthesis of thinking and doing. So the trust actually has 5,000 apartments that it owns and operates. The trust actually has a loan fund that it provides to others. And the trust actually does have people like Raymond who do preservation policy and energy efficiency policy. And that synthesis, that, one informs the other, that always fascinated me. So I always tell people who are interested in policy that it really does, I don't think it really matters a lot about landing the right first job. I think it matters a lot landing the second or third job. But the most important thing is wrapping your mind around something. And when you wrap your mind around anything, you'll gain that little bit of confidence to do what you want to do. And there's 3 things that I would urge people who are thinking about this to do. I would urge them to find something that is something that's right, that they want to do that's good, that will leave the world in a better place. Work with really smart people and have fun. And if you can do those 3 things, you'll have made a life for yourself. So public policy has done that for me. I hope it'll do that for some of your listeners.
It's really inspiring, and it's great to hear, and great words to live by, and great advice. So thank you for that. So,
and I should say this Dodger cap is not an accident. The Dodgers are playing the 2nd game of the World Series, and I'm missing that game to be with you tonight, Evan, which is saying how much I care about the Public Policy Department at Maryland.
We very much appreciate your attendance, and we'll hopefully not take too much more of your time, but we do want to give you the floor now for this presentation. So I'm going to share the screen right now.
So before we get started, just some background. I do teach in the public policy school, and I teach a class that is subtitled The Correlation of Affordable Housing, Energy Efficiency, and Racial Justice. Some of these slides I've used in my class, most I have not. I wanted to make sure we talked about the pre and post election where we are. But I will say that it's somewhat difficult to be a prognosticator today because we have so many variables, the election, the pandemic, and so many other things. But we'll do our best tonight to frame this issue both pre and post pandemic. But let's start with kind of some grounding here. So let's go to the first slide. So in the United States, unlike every other developed nation in the world, there is no right to housing. There is a goal that every person gets a decent home and a suitable living environment. That was articulated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and set forth in the 1949 Housing Act. But it is not true that every person who needs housing is entitled to housing. Every person who needs food can apply for food stamps. Every person who puts money into Social Security will receive Social Security. Certain entitlements, health care for Medicaid, if you're poor enough, you get medical care. But that's not true in the United States. It's not a right or entitlement, it's a goal. And we've honestly not met that goal, we've been far from it. As Raymond knows, who took my class, 3/4 of those who were, quote, entitled, or who would be eligible, I should say, for affordable housing in the United States are either living in slums or paying 50% of more of their income for rent, or both. So we're far from making it a right. And that's something we'll talk about as we get to the election. Go ahead. So why do we care about housing? And I spent a fair amount of time talking to people about this, because I don't think housing is the most important thing in the world. I do think that it is impossible to to reach your full potential without having a stable roof over your head. If you step back a little bit, why we should care about housing, even if we have housing, is it affects the environment. Housing produces about 20% of all greenhouse gas emissions. Raymond's working on a project called Green for All, Energy Efficiency for All, I'm sorry, Energy Efficiency for All. And that has led to the placement of tens of millions of dollars for utilities to be put in affordable housing. Nevertheless, the Trump administration has deregulated many federal energy mandates, and we'll see what happens after the election. Housing accounts for more than 20% of the economy. People don't realize it's not just our housing that matters. When we buy a house, when we live in a house, we buy stuff. We buy stuff to put in it. We pay for utilities. We use it we put our TVs in it. We do all kinds of things. I'm sitting in my home right now. The lights are on. I'm going to have dinner later. All of these things we do in our home, and it's all of those goods and services account for housing. And housing goes into the tank, and as it did in the Great Recession between 2007 and 2010. The economy goes in the tank. You can't have a good economy without a decent housing economy. And then finally, if you care about health, you have to care about housing. There's a tremendous amount of work going on right now about the correlation between good health and good housing. Many hospitals are understanding that their emergency room visitors are frequent visitors, what they call frequent flyers, and they're homeless. They're people who have all kinds of issues, who have no doctor, have no stable home, and they end up in ERs, and it costs money to treat those patients. And if you live in a lousy house or live in a slum, you're more likely to have toxic lead, mold, insect infestations, injuries, asthma, allergies, and heart disease. So there's a strong correlation, and now hospitals and health care systems are beginning to create housing funds for that very reason. Not the topic of this discussion, but I'm happy to talk to people if they'd like to talk about that. Next slide. If you care about education, you should care about housing. Where you live matters. As Raymond knows, and other people know, growing up in a poor neighborhood almost guarantees that the school that you go to will probably have a relatively high turnover rate. The teachers will be not frequently there for a very long period of time. And so it matters where one lives. So Obama put together a thing called the Fair Housing Rule. And again, it's beyond our ken tonight to talk entirely about the Fair Housing Rule, but basically it tried to encourage people in the suburbs, people like in Silver Spring and Bethesda, to accept affordable housing in those communities. And it did so not in a way that punished people if they didn't do it, but encouraged people to do it through data and persuasion. That has now been repealed by the Trump administration. Again, we'll talk about that later when we talk about the contrast between the two administrations, but it makes it harder for developers to come into Silver Spring or Bethesda and try to convince the city councils of those places that they should put in affordable housing because they lost that lever. But that is the lever, and the reason it's an important lever is because kids need to have a good education. And we just happen to know that higher income neighborhoods have, surprise, surprise, have better schools. And the opportunities and the educational opportunities that children can attain or higher if they go to those kinds of schools. And then finally, and something that is fundamental, is that everyone, including myself, anyone who's listening to this, who owns a home, if you're white and you're listening to this or viewing it, and you own a home, there's a very high probability that you're standing on the shoulders of our racist past. And what I mean by that is that from about 1938 to about 1958, the Federal Housing Administration refused to insure loans for African Americans in this country. What that meant is African Americans could not get low interest rates for homes. What that meant was African Americans and Latinos, by the way, couldn't get a loan without private mortgage insurance. It cost them more money. They had to put in bigger down payments. And again, this led to segregated housing. There's a famous story about a developer, it might have been in Cleveland, Evan, I forget where it was, who built an all-white development and wanted to get an FHA loan because he wanted a low interest rate. He wanted to be able to put it on a 30-year time basis. And the appraisal came back and said he couldn't have a loan because it was too close to what they called a, quote, Negro neighborhood, unquote. So he built a wall around the development, a large development, and he got his loan. And there's stories, there are many, many, many stories like this. But I have no compunction in saying, you know, if I am sitting on third base, it's not because I hit a triple. It's because my family, my grandfather in particular, was able to get a home loan. My father was able to take a home equity. He was able to take a home equity loan out of that home to start his business. And had my grandfather been black, that wouldn't have been the case. So, you know, we all work hard. We all do the right thing, but racism and particularly redlining has created a two-level playing field, especially in housing and especially in terms of accumulating wealth. Next slide. So where are we? We talked earlier about housing not being a right. Here's where we see the rubber meeting the road. So we have about 11 million extremely low-income rental households in the United States, constituting about 30 million people, a little over 30 million people. And for those people, we have 4 million units. So it's this kind of cruel game of musical chairs where they're all scattering around trying to get the available unit. We have existing programs, one people-based, it's called vouchers, where I take my voucher and I go into the private market. And there's another one that's place-based called the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit. And they are successful programs. It's not the fault of the programs that we are not serving people. It is the fact that those programs are not large enough and haven't been funded enough. So the critical question for the next administration is, will we begin to realize that goal in any meaningful way by expanding either the voucher or tax credit program for all eligible households? That's the question that is on housers' minds today. Next slide. Now, homeownership is fundamental. About 65% of us own, about 35% of us rent, 2/3, 1/3. And for many of us, it's the best way to create wealth. It's not the case for everyone, as we know from the Great Recession. The people who were taken advantage of, who didn't really have enough skin in the game, who ended up being foreclosed on. And that was, so it's important not to push people too hard into homeownership. There is this truth that if you do get into a home and you do pay down your mortgage over time, you will accumulate wealth because eventually you'll have something. That is true. But there are studies that show that if you put the same amount of money in the stock market over, say, 30 years, you might do almost as well. So it's important for us, we have this kind of homeownership dream, and it is a huge benefit for most people. But it's not the only way for people to accumulate wealth, and it may be not the, who knows? We know now that millennials are not as interested in home ownership as my generation and the generation after me. The other thing that we know is that homeowners are increasingly paying more than they should for their mortgages. This is during a period, by the way, pre-pandemic and post-pandemic, when housing is booming and people are wealthy, relatively speaking. Except for the pandemic, I think our unemployment rate was like 3 or 4% before the pandemic, 5%, whatever it was. So, but for the pandemic, even during the quote good old days, pre-COVID, you know, the before days, people were paying more for their mortgages. And so at some point, people get so much in debt that they have trouble making their payments, and that's not good for them. It's not good for the housing market. And then finally, not surprisingly, most homeowners are white. Most African Americans and Hispanics are not homeowners, and wealth inequality has ensued as a consequence of that disparity. And so the question that's left for the next administration is, can I provide greater incentives for low-income homeownership? That's the question that is on, should be on the administration's mind and will be on the Biden administration, should he be elected. Next slide. So COVID. I struggled to make this slide comprehensible, and I could talk about this for hours. COVID has taken what was an unequal housing crisis and turned it in, sharply increased that crisis, or made it difficult, and especially increased the risk of bankruptcy among small property owners. Forgetting about home ownership, just think about Evan, by the way, rents out a few, who you were talking before the class, he rents out a few units to some people. And it's probably not going to happen to Evan, but I have a cousin who does the same. And the administration properly put in a moratorium on evictions. The administration did not put a moratorium on rent. And so people's amount of back payment for rental debt is mounting, and it mounts every month. It started in July, it's going to end in December, and the estimates are between $25 and $34 billion of back rent. That's a lot of money, even today, that's a lot of money. And will any administration provide targeted rental assistance to all the people who need it? Or are we going to see this tsunami of evictions occurring after the moratorium expires? So pre-COVID, we had a housing market that was unequal, but people were more or less paying the rent. They had jobs. During COVID, people lost their jobs. The administration properly said, wait, can't let her put everybody on the street. So they put in a moratorium on evictions, but not on the rent being due. My cousin and Evan have to pay their bills. They have to pay their mortgage. They have to pay their rental property taxes. They have to maintain their properties. There's no rent coming into them. If they don't pay their properties or mortgages, they'll get foreclosed on. So it's this, there's this domino effect that can impact not only the tenants, but the owners, and it's a huge issue. And basically, we've stuck our head in the sand to wait till after the election to see. We'll talk about this maybe, but I don't know what the next administration will do. I hope that this administration, even if it loses in November, will do something soon. And that's the question that is being asked today. Next slide. Okay, here we get to the compare and contrast. So again, hard to put all of these things on one slide, but I wanted to get to Evan's questions. Even if Trump were to win, this CDC moratoria and the consequences for property owners of the United States is going to require some amount of targeted rental assistance. There's no way that they could not provide at least billions of targeted rental. They've basically boxed themselves in. However, I don't think this administration is going to extend the moratorium beyond January 1st. He said it a number of times, and other people have said that. And a lot of property owners are on his team. And they basically are saying, you can't extend this thing. So I do think that's going to be, I do think on January 1st, if Trump wins, there's going to be a lot of anxiety among renters and landlords, a lot of renegotiation going on. And some people will muddle through, some people will be fine, and some people will go bankrupt. The Trump administration will continue to try to slash HUD's overall budget. If the Senate stays Republican, that I don't know if they'll be able to do that if the House remains in Democratic hands, which I think it will. I don't think they'll be successful in that. They won't introduce any new affordable housing programs. They will try to privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. They've been trying to do that for about 2 years already. Then they shelved it. It was one of his primary pillars of his housing program in 2016. And what they realized once they got into the details was privatizing these things is very hard without giving some kind of a government back end, because essentially bankers and others are not willing to take the kind of risks that the private market's just not taking the kind of risk for home ownership for people making, say, under $100,000. So they'll talk about that. They might try to do it. It would be an enormous change to our housing system. It would mean a change in home ownership. It would mean that poorer people, even lower amount of income people, would probably have a hard time buying a home because they would have new down payment requirements, shorter mortgages, and so on. And then they have tried to repeal the National Housing Trust Fund, funded by Fannie and Freddie, and I think they would be able to do that in the next administration, because that's a ruling that they can make. On the other hand, the Biden administration's platform says housing is a right, not a privilege. That's a quote. And that's the first time any platform of any US president has said that. And that includes Obama, by the way. There's no question he would restore the fair housing rule, because it is so fundamental. And there's no question he would provide significantly more targeted rental assistance. In the platform, they talk about fully funding rental assistance. And so I can imagine them providing more funding for vouchers and tax credits. They specifically have a $15,000 credit closing to encourage low-income home ownership. And Raymond, they're increasing investments in resilience and energy efficiency. They actually have some targets. They talk about increasing, not repealing, the investment in the National Housing Trust Fund. And then they again talk about improving and funding and eligibility for the tax credit. So a very dramatic, a stark choice for housing post-election. I want to come back to you on December 14th, and we can talk about how it turns out.
Well, thank you for that. And I think it's really important, your last slide, to show that policy and politics are intertwined. And yeah. On one side, you have folks that are taking the Treasury stance of Hoover. I think it was Treasury Secretary Mellon, who just said, liquidate everything. Just let everything go bankrupt and let the free market take over. On the other side, you have folks who believe that housing is a right. And when the private sector doesn't support that right, then the government has to step in. Right. I guess the question that is next posed is, well, who's going to pay for it? And,
right, sure.
And how do you respond to that, where if everyone agrees that housing is a human right,
right,
where do you look to pay for it?
So 2 or 3 quick answers to that. The most important thing to remember is our housing system works for most of us. We've gone 85 yards down the field. It's not like we're can't throw the ball for a touchdown. We're close. It's this last 10 or 15 yards that we need to solve for. So when people who are listening to this think about how much it's going to cost, I mean, you could, for $5 or $6 billion annually, you could fully fund vouchers. I mean, it's not $100 billion. So it is important to say that providing housing as a right would not probably be a hugely expensive proposition. But let's assume that it would cost something, and some people, there would have to come from somewhere. Obviously, the Biden administration has a tax plan to tax people like me higher, to tax people like you lower, and that's controversial, but theoretically that could raise more revenue for the federal government. They could be used for these kinds of social programs, but probably much more cost shift as opposed to a cost burden. Think about all the costs that are being borne for homeless people being on the street, going to a hospital. One survey in Los Angeles had the ER costs for hospitals. If the people who came to their hospital were housed, their ER costs would go down by like 80%. And so there needs to be kind of a understanding that you're basically shifting the cost and trying to figure out a way so that how we're handling homelessness and how we're handling housing right now is very costly. It's very costly. It costs the hospitals, it costs the insurance companies, it comes back to your pocket and my pocket. There's no way to get around that. Somebody's going to take care of these people. They're going to be fed. Something's going to happen. And unless you're willing to take them out to sea and leave them there, they're going to be with us. So the smarter thing to do is to provide efficient, low-cost housing, get them training, get their heads right. It's a lot easier to do that. It's a lot less costly than what we're doing right now. And so that's the second answer to your question. First, there might be a cost. If there is, I don't think it's fundamentally high. The Bipartisan Policy Commission, I think, said it would cost $5 billion a year to provide vouchers to everybody. And that would be like a 15% increase in HUD's budget. And then the third answer, I think, is beyond tax change and cost shift, is that over time, providing the jobs that we are going to be to do New Deal-like for this new housing. Remember, we have 7 million households who are out there who we're going to house, is equivalent to a New Deal housing program. And that's going to raise money for governments because those properties are going to pay property taxes. It's going to raise jobs. It's going to provide all kinds of goods and services to the economy. It's actually going to increase housing's portion of the whole GDP, which will in turn mean that the economy will run better. So I honestly, and I'm not trying to just, dangle this in front of you and say, it's all good, but it's the case that really, if you look at it, doesn't cost that much. It really doesn't, because of all the benefits for housing that accrues to people having good housing.
And before turning over to Raymond, I just think it's a great way to argue with a person who may not have a humanitarian bone in their body to realize that when you have a bunch of foreclosures going on, for instance, that's going to create property values that are going to sink. You're going to have less revenue for government services, and it just continues to spiral out of control from there. But Raymond, please let me pass it to you.
I really appreciate that first question and the answer, and I think it's something that a lot of people don't consider, that the immediate investment will lead to a generational benefit, and ultimately that has a high potential to reduce the amount of funds that actually have to go into these programs later on, because these families will have access to the education that they should have access to. They will be able to work their jobs and stay healthy. taxpayers and pay into the system and have an opportunity.
Hold on, really quickly. Are you getting that feedback, Michael, on the audio? Okay. So
Yes,
Raymond,
I am, yes.
yeah. So just maybe like pull back just 15 seconds because your audio for whatever reason got like super hot, distorted. So yeah, sorry about that to mess you up.
Yeah, I'm not sure where I.
So yeah, if you
I would start at the beginning.
Yeah.
Start at the beginning.
Yeah.
You were on a roll. But what you might do is just do 30 seconds to see if it does it again. But I think you're okay.
So I just want to say I really appreciate the question and the answer, because I agree 100%. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that being able to put that upfront investment in housing is actually going to increase the potential to have to put less into housing later on, because the families in need will have the opportunities afforded to them, like education, health, being able to hold a job, become taxpayers into a system that then they will, be contributing to, and not necessarily needing the assistance from, because no one wants to be living, needing assistance and dependence. I grew up in that, and I'm really fortunate now that I do not. So I think it's really difficult because constituents want to see immediate results, instant gratification, and policymakers want to be able to provide that. And so by saying, we're going to put this investment in that will have this long-term turn effect, doesn't vibe well with so many people. And it's just really unfortunate to me.
So Michael, I'm gonna at least challenge you a little bit on something that you said on in the presentation about millennials, and you mentioned that maybe the millennials aren't interested in home ownership. Yeah. And I believe that 2008, 2009 was never something that we fully recovered from. The stock market recovered from, but the actual ability to have a job that could pay enough to cover mortgage and things like that. I believe most people want to have their own homes and start their families and those type of things. So I have heard that said before, but I'm just curious if you want to explain that a little more or not.
Sure. So let me restate it. You're quite right. Actually, studies consistently show that millennials want to buy homes. And if I said they didn't want to buy homes, that was my mistake. But they're having trouble doing so. And there are two reasons for that, obviously. Student debt is at an all-time high. And so people have already a significant amount of debt on their individual balance sheets. But more importantly, housing prices have risen a lot faster than incomes. And so it is not unusual in high-cost cities like New York and San Francisco for people earning very high salaries to not be able to afford a home because housing prices have outpaced incomes. Now, it's not true everywhere, but it is true in a lot of America. Indeed, in every county in the United States but one, someone earning a minimum wage cannot afford a reasonably priced two-bedroom apartment. And in many, many states, especially larger cities, it is difficult for one-earner families to afford a home, even a starter home. You and Raymond have been able to scrape it together, and I'm proud of you for doing that. You know how difficult it was to do. But think about what if you wanted to try to do that in Washington, D.C., or some other place, or for that matter, Bethesda or Silver Spring. It would have been harder. And so what I'm suggesting is not that people don't want to do it, but the circumstances are such that we're seeing, the actual facts are people are buying homes later than they did in my generation and the 15, it's just a fact. People who typically would have bought their first home at the age of, say, 26 or 27 are not, there's like a 4-year delay there or something like that. And that we've never had that consistently. And even since COVID, I don't know if you've noticed, prices of homes in the suburbs have gone up during COVID because people want to get outside of the cities into suburbs. And in my neighborhood, there's all kinds of for sale signs because my home's more valuable. Well, as long as that's the case, where the housing prices are rising faster than incomes, it doesn't make any difference if you're a millennial or anybody else, if you can't afford it. Now, low interest rates makes it possible to stretch, as you know, but rates are pretty darn low. They're hard to get, you can't cut them very much more. So without a rise in incomes, I don't see how we can have a rise in home ownership by millennials and people who are just in their first or second job. That's all I meant to say.
I feel like I might defend you a little more, Michael, on that, because I think that millennials want to own homes, but I think they want to also live where the action is more. And so they are, and the idea of owning a home seems so far out of reach that, you know, it's this decision of, you know, do I save and invest for all of these years, you know, by living with roommates, probably somewhere not really desirable, to then own my home, or I can afford this right now and I really like this area and it's walkable in restaurants and clubs and I'm near all my friends, so I'm just going to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a big pattern. I mean, we don't know, honestly, Evan, what's going to be the outcome of COVID. It could be that the next administration will try to muscle up Fannie and Freddie in light of what's gone on and try to put together mortgage products that will be more attainable for people of moderate incomes. But it will take, for that to happen, you have to have government assistance. The current system, the current privatized system, will not reach down and help out people who want to live in nicer neighborhoods and don't have necessarily the incomes that would support a large mortgage. So without a housing credit or something like that at the beginning to deal with the down payment or something, it's going to be hard to do it. It's not impossible. There's a National Homestead Act or something like that that Ron Wyden has put together. It hasn't gotten a lot of support, but there's all kinds of ideas, but they all require some kind of a national program.
So I really appreciate how everything is kind of interconnected with the housing. The student loan crisis right now has prevented a lot of people who've come out of school, their main monthly payments, you know, used to be able to be for a mortgage, is now going to student loan lenders and banks. I do want to bring up the interest rate aspect, where on a 4% loan on the home that I have, which I have a lot of gratitude, and I agree that being able to build the wealth and asset is based on the shoulders of a lot of very discriminatory policies that we need to obviously compensate for the current and future generations and change that around. But I see this 4% interest rate, and I bought in 2014. I'm very happy about that compared to 1980s. It was almost 18% through the Federal Reserve and on the 10-year, but I'm paying $200,000 over the course of 30 years to a private bank that goes to the Federal Reserve and gets almost 0% overnight window. So why can't I cut out this 4% private tax on me and just go straight to the Federal Reserve and get a 0%, and then I could pay this off in 15 years and not get taxed $200,000 to bankers, essentially?
Well, this is you've asked a fundamental question about the nature of how we allocate capital in our society. We've chosen, and we're not alone. Banks are not unique to the United States of America. I mean, banks provide a service. They provide a service by allocating risk, and no government has ever been very good, frankly, at assessing individualized risk between Evan, Michael, and Raymond, and providing them the individualized, curated loan that works just for them. So there is I do think that banks provide a service, a fundamental service that no government has never done very well. Whether they should be compensated in the amount that they're receiving is a different question. And that's a longer story, not tied only to housing policy. But I think the answer to your question lies more in whether we can reform lenders and make them more responsive to people's needs, not whether we should eliminate them. And I'm a recovering lawyer, but I know that was it in Macbeth, kill all the lawyers? I think it was Macbeth. Anyway, let's not kill all the bankers, not on this podcast anyway.
I'm all for the private sector. I just also want to acknowledge that it, like the bailout in 2009,
Right.
2008,
Right.
2009, where we bail out all these banks
Right.
and we don't reorganize them, and then they end up loaning our money back to us at interest, I think is inherently unjust and unfair, and is a part of a problem that hopefully Biden learned as a vice president for 8 years not to do that again. But there's a tremendous lobbying power within Wall Street, and that's an issue. So
I'm in violent agreement.
So one thing that I am curious, or kind of not curious, but anticipating, after the election, we have a $3 trillion deficit for this year. It's it's
going to go up.
And it was $19 trillion debt before this person, the tenant of the Oval Office, came in, and now it's 27 trillion, about there. And that is an issue. I don't believe that you can just print money endlessly. The U.S. has had a very special position as international reserve currency since 1945. Good. And I'm just anticipating, as soon as this election is over, the austerity hawks are going to come out and say, we don't have any more money left. We need to cut services, and we need to jack up interest rates. And that will then contract the economy. Austerity has never worked. When you reduce the amount of money supply, you're always going to have a downward spiral. But at the same time, I do agree that the debt and the deficits are absolutely problematic. And the only solution is to grow the economy from the $19-20 trillion economy to a $40 trillion economy over the next 10-20 years. So then the debt becomes a much smaller percentage. And it's through those investments and actually housing starts. If you can build housing for everyone, you can then build up asset and ownership and construction jobs and cement plants and logistical supply chains. And that's something that I'm very much advocating for with this next.
So I think, so again, we find ourselves in agreement. We will see, Evan, and you're anticipating a Biden election. I'm not anticipating anything. I don't know. But assuming Biden wins, and assuming the Senate gets closer, maybe even down to one vote or less, I do think you'll see an infrastructure bill of some kind. I don't think it'll meet Evan Papp's anticipated wants or needs, but it'll meet a lot of things. And it'll begin, and if it produces, and I hope it does, within the next 4 years, some growing of the economy, that will push back on these austerity measures that you talked about. The other thing you have to remember is that as much as we do or don't like the Federal Reserve, so far they've remained relatively independent and have not raised interest rates without reason. As long as the economy is contracting or not, as long as people are you have an 8% unemployment or 7% unemployment or 9%, whatever it is going into 2020, 2021. I don't see interest rates rising anytime soon. There will be people saying, let's cut back the federal government, let's reform Social Security, and so on. And that it could happen, especially if Trump wins. I think, let me put it this way, if Trump wins, you're exactly right. There's no question about that. The austerity hawks will come out. There will not be an infrastructure bill. There will not, or if it isn't, it will not be the kind of infrastructure that's going to really help people. I just don't think we know. And there's an old saying in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I commend it to you. It said, don't live in the wreckage of the future. And I suggest that all of us, especially right now, not live in the wreckage of the future. We have enough going on right now. Let's just get to November 4th. Hopefully the right outcome will happen, and then we can start living for the future.
And I know we're getting low on time, but Raymond, could you talk a little bit about the green opportunity for housing and what you're kind of focused on with that? And Michael as well, please jump in, because I know you have a deep background in that.
So the Energy Efficiency for All program, as I mentioned earlier, it's a project that exists in 12 states. Most of them are on the eastern side of the country. We do operate in California as well. And it really looks at the intersection of environment, energy, and housing. And so the project is comprised of leaders in housing policy, in energy policy, in environmental policy, who come together and come up with tactics, depending on the state and localities that they're working in, to target low-income multifamily housing and make it more energy efficient, and as a way to reduce the energy burden, which was one of the issues that Michael talked about in his slides, where families are paying more than 50% of their income to live in their homes, and in addition, suffering worse health outcomes, which leads to higher cost in healthcare, which leads to children missing school, and people missing work. And so it is looking at housing from this one aspect and trying to improve it. And what we are finding is there's the EVA program overall has had a lot of wins, and it's been very effective, which is why it continues to be funded and grow over the last several years. With COVID, it has definitely shifted our focus and really put us on more defense than we already were with this administration. And so there's, I feel like, for me personally, in the work that I'm doing, there's really a drive to maintain what we have and not lose additional funding, not lose the regulations that we already have. In Philadelphia, we have Act 129, which is the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is going into a new phase. And now, because of COVID, the energy producers are saying, well, we can't, because of COVID, we can't really meet these new targets. So, we should get some leeway and maybe reduce the goals some. And we're seeing that in several different types of policies throughout all of EFA. And so really we are just trying to prevent that from happening right now.
I'll just repeat, Evan, that the Biden administration has a whole section on energy efficiency in housing. There have been a lot of plans. Obama has had some plans, and we actually, during the Obama administration, started energy efficiency for all. And I think weatherized something like 100,000 subsidized apartments. So it's not out of the question, depending on if Biden wins, that Raymond's concerns, his present concerns, could be reversed. Well, certainly, it's not going to happen in November, December, but in the next, a year from now, you could certainly see a different attitude towards what he's doing.
Yeah, and I glanced at that plan, and it looks like, there's substantial funding that they are, listing. Of course, as you mentioned, Evan, how are these things paid for? And it's not just a matter of, Biden signing something and making it happen. There has to be buy-in and an understanding. And for something like this, energy efficiency, you really are banking on others buying into the long-term benefits. There really are very few instant benefits that people see. And so it always makes that a harder sell.
And just trying to get all of the different interest groups together, saying the construction folks are going to be able to retrofit all these buildings. Those are jobs. And a lot of it, though, is always going to come down to finance and who's going to pay for it. Is it going to be a progressive tax or the opposite of that?
So just to make sure we don't leave anybody with the wrong impression, there are a number of financial models that demonstrate that when we reduce the utility payments by landlords, they are able to keep rents more affordable because their operating costs are going down. And something like the largest controllable operating expense a multifamily owner has is his or her energy burden. So reducing that burden not only helps the climate, it also means that they don't have to charge higher rents, and it means they're able to operate their property more efficiently. So there are loan funds now that are predicated on giving you a loan to retrofit your property, and I'll counter my repayment by your lowered energy bills. And so it's quite true that it's not an immediate payback, but it's for some of these utility installations and what they do, these incentives, it's pretty quick payback. So we'll see. I'm more hopeful. I think that I think we've kind of turned the corner on energy efficiency. I think people have kind of gotten the message.
Yeah, I think I would agree with that. I think, especially with it being tied to climate, there really is a big focus on that. So I really appreciate that point.
Well, I really appreciate this conversation. There's always going to be more opportunity. And Michael, I'd love to have you come back on, after the election. But I know you have a very important sporting event to attend to with the Dodgers.
I do indeed.
So thank you very much for coming on. And this is episode 5 of the Policy Dialogue series.